In this new universe, the TMNT, along with their human allies April O'Neil and Casey Jones, have been separated, and their main priority is finding one another. Well, that, and stopping the god of mischief from conquering the Earth. With the Tesseract in his grasp, and brainwashed heroes like Raphael and Clint Barton by his side, can Loki be stopped? Location, Earth 616, Shield Helicarrier. After what felt like an eternity, their plane finally landed on the surface of the helicarrier. The doors of the aircraft opened and 3 people stepped out, with the youngest 2 practically bouncing up and down in excitement. These 2, who just happened to be human-sized mutant turtles, each wore a headband with a color that corresponded with their personality. Donatello, who wore a purple headband, is the brains among his brothers. Creative, ambitious, and wise beyond his years. Standing beside Donnie was his brother Michelangelo, whose headband was orange, and the younger turtle is what they call the party dude. His innocence is often mistaken for ignorance, but Mikey probably has the most potential out of all his brothers. The guy wields a pair of nunchucks for Pete's sake. There is no way an idiot would be able to utilize such a weapon so efficiently like Michelangelo does. Looking around the giant airship they have boarded, Donnie was amazed by the helicarrier's design, and he could not wait to explore its interior. Imagining the advanced technology S.H.I.E.L.D. has in its possession made the genius turtle rub his hands together in anticipation. Mikey, on the other hand, tried to sneak onto one of the jets that was stationed on the helicarrier so he could fly it. Fortunately, the adult that was with them, Nick Fury, grabbed the tails of the turtle's orange bandana and pulled back to force Michelangelo to stop. The bandana shifted until it was covering Mikey's eyes, and when Fury finally let go, the turtle frantically clawed at the piece of clothing to straighten it out. Donatello could not help but chuckle at the sight, but he apologized to Nick for his brother's impulsive behavior. He would not even allow Michelangelo to drive the Shellraiser, and for good reason. So the last thing anyone wanted was for the youngest mutant turtle to get behind the wheel of an aircraft that was armed with weapons. Fury laughed and dismissed Donatello's words with a wave of his hand. As the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., the African-American man could handle a little chaos, especially from a kid like Mikey. But Fury's smile faded when one of his most trusted agents, Phil Coulson, stepped onto the docking bay with left arm in a sling. Despite his injury, Coulson smiled at his boss and joked about how Nick and the Turtles must have had a better time than he did in the last couple of hours. Ignoring the agent's words, Nick immediately demanded that Coulson tell him what happened, and Coulson was about to explain when Donnie interrupted the men's conversation. The turtle did apologize, but he wanted to know about Raphael, another of his turtle brothers. It was the main reason why Donatello and Michelangelo decided to accompany Nick Fury to the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier in the first place, and of course, to escape forced labor. Working for the CIA had been fun, Donnie had to admit, but if they believed they could keep the turtle from seeing his brothers, then they were sorely mistaken. And Mikey, well, he definitely did not want to make a career out of being a bodyguard for a pompous, rich guy. Looking at the two turtles, Coulson shook his head and apologized to them. The turtles instantly thought the worst, and Phil could see the tears already forming in Donnie and Mikey's eyes. The man placed a hand on each of the teens' shoulders and tried his best to calm the turtles down by stating that Raphael was not dead. But in the back of Coulson's mind, he could not help but think that death would have been merciful for Raph. Location: Kolkata, India. Rushing into the small house, Dr. Bruce Banner was about to follow the little girl further inside to meet her sickly father. But instead, the child sprinted across the room and out of a nearby window, disappearing into the night. Banner had to laugh, knowing he had stepped headfirst into a trap. He sure was a sucker for kids. Emerging from the shadows, a woman wearing a sleek black dress with a red shawl wrapped around her arms smiled softly at Bruce. She even joked about how the man picked the worst place to live, considering he wanted to avoid stress. Bruce did not comment on the joke, but he did make the assumption that the house was surrounded by some of the woman's allies. However, the mysterious female denied it and said that she and a friend of hers were the only ones here. Bruce raised an eyebrow, confused as to who this friend was and where they were located because he did not see anyone else in the house. The woman nodded her head to a corner of the room, and Banner turned to see a middle-aged man leaning against the wall, adjusting his thick, rounded glasses. The doctor took a step back, his eyes wide, as he could have sworn nothing was in that corner just a second ago. Where did this other man come from? The woman pinched the bridge of her nose and spoke to her partner, saying that the man should stop sneaking around like that. The middle-aged man smiled sheepishly and rubbed the back of his neck, apologizing as he did so. It was not like he did it on purpose, but he felt the need to say he was sorry anyway. To make sure he was clearly seen by everyone in the room, the man stood beside his comrade and introduced himself to Bruce, stating his name to be Donatello. Any other time, Banner would have commented on the name since Donatello was his favorite artist of the Renaissance, but the doctor simply nodded and told Donatello his own name in return. He then turned back to the woman and asked for her identity, which she replied by saying her name was Natasha Romanoff. "Are you here to kill me, Miss Romanoff?" Donatello was surprised by the question, and he looked at Natasha with wide eyes. The innocent look on the middle-aged man's face was actually kind of adorable, Natasha thought, and even more so when she thought about the face that was hidden beneath the man's disguise. Even with the man's whole situation. Patting her comrade on his shoulder, Romanoff quickly dismissed Banner's idea and said she was here on behalf of S.H.I.E.L.D. to ask for his help. And there was no point in Bruce saying no, because Natasha was sure she could convince him to assist her. But Bruce asked the woman what would happen if the other guy declined her offer. Donatello was aware of Dr. Banner's alter ego due to his time with the CIA, but it has been a little over a year since the other guy made his appearance. And Donnie doubted that Bruce would break that streak unnecessarily. Natasha voiced her partner's thoughts to Bruce, and even commented on how she had her own giant green ally to protect her if needed. Banner frowned at the comment, and Natasha nodded her head to Donatello, signaling him to drop his disguise. Nodding back, Donnie looked down at the watch on his wrist, which was in actuality a camouflage device that made him appear to be a middle-aged human male. But once the device was turned off, the man's true identity was revealed to be a human-sized mutant turtle. Oh, and he was a teenager. A small gasp escaped Banner's lips, and he stumbled back into a wall. Donnie sighed. He was used to this kind of behavior whenever a human saw him and his brothers, but it was still bothersome, especially now that so many people like S.H.I.E.L.D. now knew what the turtle looked like. Ignoring Dr. Banner's shocked expression, Donatelli explained how S.H.I.E.L.D. was looking for someone who could trace the Tesseract, a cubed container which held one of the 6 Infinity Stones, specifically the Space Stone. The container emitted a gamma signature that was too weak to trace, and while Donnie did look into gamma radiation briefly, he was no expert. Yet. So, if anyone could help S.H.I.E.L.D. find the Tesseract, it was Dr. Banner, who was more than acquainted with the world of gamma radiation. Donnie pleaded with Bruce to join them on their quest to retrieve the Tesseract, not just for S.H.I.E.L.D., but for his brother Raphael. Location: New York City. Gym. The poor punching bag stood no chance against Steve Rogers, who was currently pummeling the bag while barely breaking a sweat. But his thoughts were not just on the bag in front of him. Memories flashed through the man's mind, and with each passing one, his fist struck the punching bag faster and faster. Finally, with one powerful punch, Steve knocked the bag off its chain and watched as it flew across the gym. He took a few deep breaths before picking up another bag from the floor, with several of them lined up like pigs for slaughter. But Rogers froze when he heard clapping coming from the entrance of the gym. He turned to see two figures standing in the doorway, with the one clapping smiling widely. He had short blonde hair and eyes that shined blue like sapphires. Rogers noted that the blonde was clearly younger than he was, but the other man's behavior seemed almost childish. Innocent, even. Beside the blonde was someone Steve recognized, and he and Fury engaged in some small talk while the younger man explored the gym. Nick handed a file to Steve, and in it showed a report on the Tesseract. Rogers was familiar with the object, but it was clear that the man was wary of it. As the former soldier looked over the information, Nick looked in the direction of his young comrade, who had grabbed the punching bag Steve was dragging before. The blonde hung the bag on a chain and proceeded to punch and kick at the bag like the other man before him. Hearing the commotion behind him, Steve looked over his shoulder and watched the blonde for a moment, before commenting on the younger man's skill to Nick. Nick smiled, looking like a proud parent, and he stated that even though Michelangelo was young, he was an extremely talented fighter. The African-American added that Rogers should see Mikey fight with his nunchucks. That was truly a sight to behold. After their conversation was done, Steve stood up and walked over to Michelangelo. "The gym's all yours, kid. Keep it up." With that, Rogers took one of the punching bags still on the floor and slung it over his shoulder. He used his free hand to grab his duffel bag and then moved towards the exit of the gym. Mikey smiled and waved his hand at the former soldier while yelling, "Goodbye." But the blonde forgot about the bags on the ground, and when he took a small step forward, Mikey tripped over one. The blonde man rolled across the floor, and the small button on his watch was accidentally pressed as he moved. When he skidded to a stop at Steve's feet, Michelangelo let out a small ouch and placed his hand on his aching forehead. But he quickly noticed how, instead of 5 human fingers, his hands were back to their normal, 3-fingered selves. Mikey gulped and slowly looked up at Rogers, who stared back in silence. What would he do next? Location: Stuttgart, Germany. Among the crowd of scared civilians, 2 individuals looked upon the caped villain in disdain rather than fear. The 2 men were given the same orders: stay put unless your assistance is absolutely necessary. Donatello and Michelangelo hated being put on the sidelines, and they were sure it had something to do with their young ages. Despite more than proving themselves in combat, the members of S.H.I.E.L.D. still saw them as children. It irritated the 2 teens, but they decided to keep their feelings to themselves and follow Fury's instructions. After all, they still needed S.H.I.E.L.D's help if they had any chance of finding their missing brother and their friends. The disguised turtles glared at their target, who walked about the crowd with his horned crown glistening beneath the moonlight. The god of mischief in the flesh, Loki. If he had not brainwashed their brother and was threatening the safety of the world, Donatello and Michelangelo would have been excited to meet Loki, as they believed him to simply be a character of mythology. Beside Donnie was an elderly man with thinning white hair and a stern expression that reminded the teen of his father. A wave of sadness suddenly passed over Donatello, and he shook his head to clear himself of those negative thoughts. Right now, he needs to focus on the mission. But when he felt the old man shift beside him, Donnie looked back and saw the man moving to stand up. The genius quickly grabbed the older man's arm to stop him, whispering for him to stay down. The old man smiled softly at Donnie and patted him on his hand while saying this was something he needed to do. He was not about to kneel to some jerk with a stupid costume. Donatello continued to protest, but the old man ignored him and stood defiantly before Loki. Loki raised an eyebrow at the elderly man and demanded that he go back to kneeling before his new ruler. The old man refused, which only made Loki laugh, and he aimed the end of his scepter at the mortal. Donnie gasped, and just as the god fired his weapon, the teen stood and shielded the old man, preparing to take on the blast himself. He could even hear Michelangelo shouting his name, and the genius could only imagine the terrified look on his little brother's face, because his eyes were shut tightly as he mentally prepared for the incoming blow. But it never came. Slowly, Donatello opened his eyes and was surprised to see a man standing in front of him, holding up a rounded shield. By the design of the shield and the man's costume, practically screaming, USA. With its color scheme, Donatello knew his savior was Captain America. This would be the turtle's first time seeing Cap in his uniform. Captain America lowered his shield and looked in the direction of Loki, who had landed face first on the ground when the hero deflected his blast. Glancing over his shoulder, Cap gave a simple nod to Donatello. It was his way of saying good job. The stupidest grin spread across Donnie's face, grateful that someone had acknowledged his bravery. Location: Quinjet, leaving Germany. An uncomfortable silence settled within the Quinjet, and everyone's attention was on the now captured Loki. Well, almost everyone. Donatello was too busy drooling over the red and gold armor of the newest member of the team, Tony Stark, the CEO of Stark Industries, but most know him well as the superhero Iron Man. Feeling the turtle's gaze on him, Stark chuckled and took a seat next to Donnie so he could get a better look at his armor. He even held up one of his biceps and asked if Donatello thought his armor was cool. Donatello nodded furiously and slowly reached out to touch the sleek red armor that covered Tony's arm. As he did so, the genius asked Stark what material he used to create the armor and if he ever considered using nanomachines. Tony smirked and commented that Donnie must know a bit about engineering. Donatello was just happy that someone was interested in his scientific genius, and he immediately went on a rant about his many inventions. The last of the list were the camouflage devices that the turtle and his brother were currently wearing on their wrists. Hearing this, Tony placed a hand under his chin, impressed by Donnie's accomplishments. But he was also curious to see what the teen really looked like, and he asked Donatello to turn off the device. The man added that he would not judge even if Donatello looked more handsome than he did. Laughing at the joke, Donnie reached for the button on his watch and was about to reveal his true identity to Tony when the sound of thunder made him look out the front window. Dark clouds enveloped the Quinjet, and blue lightning bolts struck dangerously close to the aircraft. Natasha managed to maneuver the jet out of harm's way, but all of a sudden something landed harshly on the top of the craft with a loud thud. Tony quickly stood from his seat and told Donatello and Michelangelo to stay put while he placed his helmet on. He then pressed one of the buttons situated on a small panel, and soon the back door of the Quinjet opened. And the last thing Stark or anyone aboard the Quinjet expected to see was an angry man with radiant blonde hair and blue eyes that were focused on one person only, Loki. As he marched towards the imprisoned god of mischief, Iron Man moved to raise his hand and fire at the newcomer, but he was too slow. Instead, Stark was hit square in his chest by a big hammer that the mysterious man wielded. Iron Man flew back, colliding with Captain America and causing them to fall on the floor in a heap. Donnie and Mikey unbuckled their seatbelts and stood from their seats with their weapons in hand, But the mystery blonde ignored them and proceeded to grab Loki by the collar of his shirt. The blonde then flew out the black door into the storm and disappeared before either of the turtles could act. Who was that man? Location? Unknown forest. Captain America, Donatello, and Michelangelo had just landed in the forest while Iron Man was in the middle of a battle with the blonde stranger. Seeing the damage they had caused from their fighting, Cap wanted to put a stop to it as soon as possible. He took off into the forest with Donnie and Mikey close behind him, and they had just reached Iron Man when another figure made his sudden appearance. Iron Man and his opponent were about to throw another punch at one another, but were stopped by a katana, piercing into the ground between them. Looking up at the fallen tree beside them, Cap, Donnie, and Mikey gasped at the sight of another mutant turtle standing above them. Like his brothers, he wore a colored headband, but his was the color blue. A color meaning trust and serenity. A color worn by a leader. "Leo!" Donnie and Mikey exclaimed and scrambled onto the tree towards their brother. Since they were still wearing their human disguises, Leonardo did not know that it was actually his brothers who had called out to him, but their voices did sound familiar. The two younger turtles pounced onto Leo and pulled him into a bear hug that threatened to cut off his oxygen supply, while Leo repeatedly asked the two humans who they were and struggled to get air back into his lungs. The trio was unaware of the large crack forming within the tree beneath them. It was already damaged due to the recent fight, but it could no longer hold the weight of the three teens on top of it, and soon enough it broke down even further and the turtles fell harshly onto the ground. Leonardo was the first to get up, but in doing so he accidentally pressed the button on Michelangelo's watch and the disguise disappeared in an instant. Now back to his turtle self, Mikey groaned about unintentionally losing his disguise again, and loudly demanded for Donnie to make the watches accident-proof. Leo just stared in disbelief at his youngest brother for a few seconds before embracing Michelangelo, tears streaming down his face as he did so. He was so relieved to see his brothers were safe, especially after what happened back in their universe. Losing his disguise as well, Donatello joked about not being included in the Hugfest, and Leonardo wasted no time in pulling the genius into his embrace too. That was 2 and 1 more to go, Leo thought, but his joy ceased when he noticed that Raphael was nowhere to be found. The leader inquired about the red-banded turtle's whereabouts, but Donnie and Mikey's faces immediately fell at the question. After taking a deep breath, Donatello said he would explain everything once they were safe on the shield helicarrier. Leo nodded, but he could not shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to Raphael.